Inigo Jones was the first significant English architect of Welsh ancestry in the early modern period, and the first to employ Vitruvian rules of proportion and symmetry in his buildings. As the most notable architect in England, Jones was the first person who introduced the classical architecture of Rome and the Italian Renaissance to Britain. He left his mark on London by single buildings, such as the Queen's House, which is the first building in England designed in a pure classical style, and the Banqueting House, Whitehall, as well as the layout for Covent Garden Square, which became a model for future developments in the West End. He made major contributions to stage design by his work as theatrical designer for several dozen masques, most by royal command and many in collaboration with Ben Jonson. Early life and career. Beyond the fact that he was born in Smithfield, London, the son of Inigo Jones, a Welsh clothworker, and baptized at the Church of St. Bartholomew, little is known about Jones's early years. He did not approach the architectural profession in the traditional way, namely either by rising up from a crafter through early exposure to the office of works, although there is evidence that Christopher Wren obtained information that recorded Jones as an apprentice joiner in St. Paul's Churchyard. At some point before 1603, a rich patron sent him to Italy to study drawing after being impressed by the quality of his sketches. From Italy he travelled to Denmark, where he worked for King Christian on the design of the palaces of Rosenborg and Frederiksborg. Jones first became famous as a designer of costumes and stage settings, especially after he brought masques to the stage. Under Queen Anne's patronage, he is credited with introducing movable scenery and the proscenium arch to English theatre. Between 1605 and 1640, he was responsible for staging over 500 performances, collaborating with Ben Jonson for many years. Despite a relationship fraught with competition and jealousy, the two had arguments about whether stage design or literature was more important in theatre. Over 450 drawings from the scenery and costumes survive, demonstrating Jones's virtuosity as a draftsman and his development between 1605 and 1609, from initially showing no knowledge of Renaissance draftsmanship to exhibiting an accomplished Italianate manner and understanding of Italian set design, particularly that of Alfonso and Giulio Paraghi. This development suggests a second visit to Italy, circa 1606, influenced by the ambassador Henry Wotton. Jones learned to speak Italian fluently, and there is evidence that he owned an Italian copy of Andrea Palladio's I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, with marginalia that refer Wotton. His architectural work was particularly influenced by Palladio. To a lesser extent, he also held to the architectural principles of the ancient Roman rite of Vitruvius. Jones's first recorded architectural design is for a monument to Lady Cotton, circa 1608, showing early signs of his classical intentions. Around this time, Jones also produced drawings for the New Exchange in the Strand and the central tower of St. Paul's Cathedral, displaying a similar practical architectural inexperience and immature handling of themes from sources including Palladio, Serlio and Sangallo. In 1609, having perhaps accompanied Lord Salisbury's son and heir, Viscount Cranbourne, around France, he appears as an architectural consultant at Hatfield House, making small modifications to the design as the project progressed, and in 1610, Jones was appointed surveyor to Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales. He devised a masque for the prince and was possibly involved in some alterations to St. James's Palace. On the 27th of April 1613, Jones was appointed the position of surveyor of the King's works, and shortly after, embarked on a tour of Italy with the Earl of Arundel, destined to become one of the most important important patrons in the history of English art. On this trip, Jones was exposed to the architecture of Rome, Padua, Florence, Vicenza, Genoa and Venice among others. His surviving sketchbook shows his preoccupation with such artists as Parmigianino and Schiavone. He is also known to have met Vincenzo Scamozzi at this time. His annotated copy of Palladio's Quattro Libri dell'Architettura also demonstrates his close interest in classical architecture. Jones gave priority to Roman antiquity rather than observing the contemporary fashion in Italy. He was probably the first Englishman to study these Roman remains firsthand, and this was key to the new architecture Jones introduced in England. Architecture. After Jones elaborated court entertainment masques, he began his second visit to Italy, and after he came back from his inspired city, in September 1615, Jones was appointed Surveyor General of the King's Works, marking the beginning of Jones's career in earnest. Fortunately, both James I and Charles I spent lavishly on the buildings, contrasting hugely with the economical court of Elizabeth I. As the King's Surveyor, Jones built some of his key buildings in London. In 1616, work began on the Queen's House, Greenwich, for James I's wife Anne. With the foundations laid and the first story built, work stopped suddenly when Anne died in 1619. Work resumed in 1629, but this time for Charles I's queen, Henrietta Maria. It was finished in 1635 as the first strictly classical building in England, employing ideas found in the architecture of Palladio and ancient Rome. This is Jones's earliest surviving work. Between 1619 and 1622, the Banqueting House in the Palace of Whitehall was built, a design derived from buildings by Scamozzi and Palladio and with a ceiling painted by Peter Paul Rubens. The Banqueting House was one of several projects where Jones worked with his personal assistant and nephew by marriage John Webb. Unfortunately, as the last great strongholds to the Cavaliers, the great mansion inside of Basing House was destroyed by Cromwell's army, and even the walls were broken into many pieces on the 8th of October 1645. The Queen's Chapel, St James's Palace, was built between 1623 and 1627 for Charles I's Roman Catholic wife, Henrietta Maria. Parts of the design originate in the Pantheon of ancient Rome, and Jones evidently intended the church to evoke the Roman temple. These buildings show the realization of a mature architect with a confident grasp of classical principles and an intellectual understanding of how to implement them. The other project in which Jones was involved is the design of Covent Garden Square. He was commissioned by the Earl of Bedford to build a residential square, which he did along the lines of the Italian Piazza of Livorno. It is the first regularly planned square in London. The Earl felt obliged to provide a church, and he warned Jones that he wanted to economize. He told him to simply erect a barn, and Jones's oft-quoted response was that his lordship would have the finest barn in Europe. In the design of St. Paul's, Jones faithfully adhered to Vitruvius's design for a Tuscan temple, and it was the first wholly and authentically classical church built in England. The inside of St. Paul's, Covent Garden, was gutted by fire in 1795, but externally it remains much as Jones designed it and dominates the west side of the piazza. Jones also designed the square of Lincoln's Inn Fields, and a house in the square. The Lindsey House, built in 1640, is often attributed to Jones. Its design of a rusticated ground floor with giant pilasters above supporting the entablature and balustrade served as a model for other townhouses in London, such as John Nash's Regent's Park Terraces, as well as in other English towns such as Bath's Royal Crescent. Another large project Jones undertook was the repair and remodeling of St. Paul's Cathedral. Between the years of 1634 and 1642, Jones wrestled with the dilapidated Gothicism of old St. Paul's, casing it in classical masonry and totally redesigning the west front. Jones incorporated the giant scrolls from Vignola and Della Porta's Church of the Gesù with a giant Corinthian portico, the largest of its type north of the Alps, but was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Also around this time, circa 1638, Jones devised drawings completely redesigning the Palace of Whitehall, but the execution of these designs was frustrated by Charles I's financial and political difficulties. More than 1,000 buildings have been attributed to Jones, but only a very small number of those are certain to be his work. According to architecture historian John Summerson, the modern concept of an architect's artistic responsibility for a building did not exist at the time, and Jones' role in many instances may be that of a civil servant in getting things done rather than as an architect. Jones' contribution to a building may also simply be verbal instructions to a mason or bricklayer and providing an Italian engraving or two as a guide, or the correction of drafts. In the 1630s, Jones was in high demand and, as surveyor to the king, his services were only available to a very limited circle of people, so often projects were commissioned to other members of the works. Stoke Bruerne Park in Northamptonshire was built by Sir Francis Crane, receiving the assistance of Inigo Jones, between 1629 and 1635. Jones is also thought to have been involved in another country house, this time in Wiltshire. Wilton House was renovated from about 1630 onwards, at times worked on by Jones, then passed on to Isaac House when Jones was too busy with royal clients. He then returned in 1646 with his student, John Webb, to try and complete the project. Contemporary equivalent architects included Sir Balthazar Gerber and Nicholas Stone. One of Jones's design work was Double Cube Room, and it was also the foundation stone of his status as the father of British architecture. Jones, as the pioneer in his era, had strong influence during the time. His revolutionary ideas even affect beyond the court circle, and today, many scholars believe that he also started the golden age of British architecture. Black Sky to Hampshire later life. Jones's full-time career effectively ended with the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642 and the seizure of the King's houses in 1643. His property was later returned to him, but Jones ended his days, unmarried, living in Somerset House. He was, however, closely involved in the design of Coles Hill House, in Berkshire, for the Pratt family, which he visited with the young apprentice architect Roger Pratt to fix a new site for the proposed mansion. He died on the 21st of June 1652 and was subsequently buried with his parents at St. Bennet Paul's Wharf, the Welsh church of the City of London. John Denham and then Christopher Wren followed him as King's Surveyor of Works. A monument dedicated to him was destroyed in the Great Fire in 1666. Legacy. In Jones's early life, he was born in a clothworker's family, and grew up with his father in England. His father had little to give and little to leave to his son, so Jones started to strive for living at the very beginning of his life. Even though Jones was famous as an architect, he was early noticed by his talent on drawing and stage designing. From his first biography, he said himself particularly taken notice of for his skill in the practice of landscape painting. Later, his creativity attracted one of the great lords at the court, and the court sent Jones to Italy for learning landscape painting. However, in Italy, Jones finally found his talent on architecture, and this discovery changed his life routine. and eventually changed the history of British architecture. According to Jones's words, "In my younger years, I applied myself to search out the ruins of those ancient buildings. Having satisfied myself in these, and returning to my native country, I applied my mind more particularly to architecture." There is not many direct information about the career routine of Jones, and the only one is from a passage in the Vindication of Stonehenge, which is written by Webb, Jones' executor. He was architect general unto 4 mighty kings, 2 heroic queens, and that illustrious and never to be forgotten Prince Henry. Just a few months before Jones's death, February 1596, he described himself as cloth worker of the parish of St. Bennet Paul's Wharf. Because of this, Jones passed his work to his son, and asked him to bury himself in the channel of St. Bennet Paul's Wharf, by the side of his wife. Talking about Jones's life, the most influential architect in British history died peacefully in the early summer of 1652. Many of his life stories from different versions of his biographers are written with some similar minor mistakes. Actually, these errors are obviously and easy to fix, but most of the books about Jones's life are copied from each other, so day by day, recovering the errors is more and more hard. He was an influence on a number of 18th-century architects, notably Lord Burlington and William Kent. There is an Inigo Jones Road in Charlton, southeast London, near Charlton House, some of whose features were allegedly designed by him. A bridge in Llanrwst, North Wales, named Pont Fawr, is also known locally as Pont Inigo Jones, Inigo Jones's Bridge. He is also said to be responsible from the Masonic document called the Inigo Jones Manuscript, from around 1607, a document of the old charges of Freemasonry. List of architectural works. Gallery of architectural works.